I welcome you all, my dear students, on Dr. Reena's Physiology, Core, Conceptual, Integrated. So, as we were studying, synapse, and we had already covered the structure of the synapse, we've covered the synaptic transmission, the differences between the IPSP, EPSP, the types between the electrical synapse and the chemical synapse. Let's move on now towards the properties of synapse. So this is a very important LAQ. You can get just a 2 marks BAQ. Enumerate the properties of synapse and describe. Then you should know the different types of synaptic inhibition with example, because this will be very important for your future learning of the MCQs. So let's get started and enumerate the different properties of synapse. These are law of forward conduction, synaptic delay, convergence, divergence, summation, synaptic inhibitions, occlusion and the subliminal fringe phenomenon, synaptic fatigue, synaptic facilitation. So you can see that there are n number of properties which I have enumerated, and I will be taking them in two parts, part 1 and part 2, so that the understanding is very nice and crystal clear to you, right? So let's begin with the first property, that is law of forward conduction, that is one-way conduction. You know that the chemical synapse, okay, the chemical synapse will always follow, the chemical synapse will always follow one-way conduction. That means the conduction will always be from the presynaptic terminal to the postsynaptic terminal. So what is one-way conduction? That the information is always going to pass from the presynaptic terminal to the postsynaptic terminal. This is also called as the law of dynamic polarity, right? It is also called as the law of dynamic polarity. So first important thing, what is one-way conduction, which is also called as the law of dynamic polarity? Second, what is it? As it is passing from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic terminal. Next important thing, what is the cause of this, right? The next important thing which we need to know is what is the cause of this forward conduction or the law of dynamic polarity. You know that the neurotransmitter substance, it is always secreted from the presynaptic terminal, and it will have a receptor binding site on the postsynaptic terminal. So it is because of this simple and a basic reason that the neurotransmitter will always be released from the presynaptic terminal, which will always bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic terminal. We already seen that there is a postsynaptic density where the receptors are located. So what happens that if any time, even if the impulses, they conduct antidromically, right? If the impulses, they try to conduct antidromically, that means they try to go in the axon, they will die out at the soma, right? They will die out at the soma. So even if they try, they will die out at the soma. What is the reason that why they will die out on the soma? Because there is lack of the neurotransmitter substance from there. So this is very a good phenomenon, that even if the impulses, they will try to go back towards the presynaptic terminal, they will never be conducted, they will die out because of the lack of the neurotransmitter substance. Now what is the significance of this? Like, what is the significance? Why, I mean, what is the importance that there is a one-way conduction, that the impulses will always pass from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic terminal? The significance of this is that, remember that the axon, they can conduct, the axons can conduct impulse in either direction, okay? That means dromically as well as antidromically. So the impulse can conduct, the axon can conduct the impulses in either direction with ease. But this synapse, what does it do? The synapse basically behaves as a valve. Okay, so the synapse is basically behaving as a valve, and it is responsible for the orderly conduction of impulse. It is important for the orderly conduction of the impulse only in one direction, that is from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic terminal, right? So what is the law of forward conduction? That is one-way conduction. What is the cause? Release of neurotransmitter substance. And what is the significance? Orderly conduction of impulse. So if you get a 2 marks BAQ, this is sufficient for your law of dynamic polarity, that is one-way conduction. The second very significant property is what is called as the synaptic delay. Okay, so what is the synaptic delay? It is the time lapse between the arrival of impulse at the presynaptic terminal to its passage in the postsynaptic terminal. मतलब कितना टाइम लग रहा है कोई भी impulse को presynaptic terminal से postsynaptic terminal में पहुंचने तक. That is synaptic delay, and the minimum synaptic delay is 0.5 milliseconds. It is always less than 1 millisecond in one synapse if we see. So what is the basic cause? The cause is, you know, that the action potential will travel. It will open the voltage gated calcium channels, which will result in the exocytosis of the neurotransmitter. It will then diffuse across the synaptic cleft. It will then bind to its receptors, which will be present on the postsynaptic membrane. Then it will either open the ion channels or it will use a G protein, and then it is going to create the local potential, that is IPSP, EPSP, and then the impulse or the action potential will be traveled. So this much time you will have to devote per synapse. So this is mandatory. There is going to be synaptic delay. So actually synaptic delay is the cause of the latent period of the reflex activity. So when you are eliciting any reflex, there is always going to be a small amount of delay in the appearance of the response. That is what is latent period. So the synaptic delay is actually responsible for the cause of the latent period. Something very interesting, if there are more number of neurons, right? If there are more number of neurons in the reflex, then obviously the synaptic delay will be more. Now this property becomes very important when later on you will study different reflexes like the monosynaptic reflex, the disynaptic reflex, the polysynaptic reflexes, and you will come to know when the number of involvement of the interneurons and the synapses are more in a particular reflex, the reaction time of that reflex will be more. So what is the significance of this synaptic delay? So when you are studying any property, you must know the significance. अगर आपको नहीं पता है तो it results in incomplete knowledge. Moreover, if you have to write a 2 marks question, you should always completely nicely write to it in a short, precise and a crisp manner. तो इसका significance होता है that the total number of neurons, right? The total number of neurons involved in a reflex can be estimated. Okay, it can be estimated from the duration of reaction time of the reflex action. Duration of reflex time of the reflex action. That means if it is a monosynaptic reflex, only 0.5 millisecond delay. If it is disynaptic, 2 synapses, 0.5 plus 0.5. But if it is polysynaptic, like a withdrawal reflex, the reaction time will be more, and from that you can calculate how many number of neurons are involved in that polysynaptic or a complex reflex, right? So what is one way conduction or the forward conduction? Then second one, what is synaptic delay? Now coming on to what is summation. Now summation is simply nothing but just a kind of an algebraic summation which we used to do when we were studying algebra, but obviously in the case of neurons it is something different. Now basically what happens, if you see in the case of neurons, you will see that, you know, if you bring about excitation of a single प्रीसिनेप्टिक टर्मिनल. ठीक है, आपने कोई भी एक सिंगल प्रीसिनेप्टिक टर्मिनल को अगर एक्साइट किया, this excitation of a single presynaptic terminal at a particular moment of time almost never excites or inhibits the postsynaptic terminal. ठीक है, मतलब अगर आपने सिर्फ एक स्टिमुलस दे दिया तो that one stimulus, if it is passing from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic, it is never sufficient in a manner so as to bring about the excitation or the inhibition of the postsynaptic terminal, because it is not able to release sufficient amount of neurotransmitter. So it is not able to release the sufficient amount of neurotransmitter. So a single summation or a single stimulus can never bring about any good excitation or inhibition of the postsynaptic neuron. So you will have to summate now. So summation can be brought about either in two forms. So you have got two types of summation, one which is called as a spatial summation and the other which is called as a temporal summation, right? So summation is the property of graded potentials or the local potentials. For example, your IPSP, EPSP or your receptor potentials, they are all examples of graded potentials which show summation. Summation is not the property of a true action potential. A true action potential which is self-propagatory will always follow the all or none law, either stimulated to a maximum or not stimulated at all. So it is never going to follow summation. Summation is only a property of graded potential. So what is summation? Summation is important to cause the simultaneous stimulation, right? A simultaneous stimulation of large number of presynaptic terminals on the postsynaptic neuron. So there is one postsynaptic neuron and you have to stimulate it. So you can stimulate it in two ways so as to give a maximum response or the maximum release of neurotransmitter. Now, what is this spatial summation and what is this temporal summation? Now, you can see over here that this is one postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so I have taken one postsynaptic neuron and at a particular or a same time I am stimulating this postsynaptic neuron simultaneously by 3 or even more neurons. So simultaneous stimulation of the postsynaptic neuron by multiple inputs, right? तो एक ही समय पर आपने बहुत सारे प्रीसिनेप्टिक न्यूरॉन्स को एक ही पोस्टसिनेप्टिक न्यूरॉन को स्टिमुलेट करने के लिए बोल दिया है. So instead of one stimulating at a time A, you are causing simultaneous stimulation by 3. That means what you are doing is you are increasing the surface area for summation, and that is what is called as a spatial summation. So the postsynaptic membrane receives impulses from large number of the presynaptic terminals simultaneously is the key word, and therefore it is also called as the space constant, right? It is also called as the space constant. So larger number of presynaptic terminals simultaneously stimulating. Now temporal is totally different. टेम्परल में हम क्या करेंगे? वी आर गोइंग टू इंक्रीज द रेट ऑफ एक्साइटेशन, राइट? वी आर गोइंग टू इंक्रीज द रेट ऑफ एक्साइटेशन. सो यहाँ पर यू कैन सी दैट this is your temporal summation, where there is only one presynaptic terminal, there is only one postsynaptic terminal, but यहाँ पर what we have done is the rate of stimulation or the frequency of stimulation is increased. For example, if you were giving at 5 per minute, now you've given at 10 per minute, 15 per minute, and so on. So what is the principle of temporal? Repeated stimuli are applied at short interval, therefore it is called as a time constant. So by this summation you're going to bring about increase in the release of the neurotransmitter and a development of a sufficient amount of either IPSP or EPSP to complete the action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So summation ka effect would be doubled when you are giving single you are not able to elicit the response. So either you increase the frequency or you increase the inputs to the postsynaptic terminal. So remember, they are examples of graded, or this is the property of the graded potentials, which is summation. So individually each property can come as a BAQ, or definitely all of them going to come together as an LAQ. Now, coming on to the next very important property is what is called as convergence and divergence. So you can see it very well. See, यहाँ पर क्या दिख रहा है? That there is one source. There is one source or one postsynaptic terminal to which different sources are ending. See. So you can see as if, you know, lots of information is coming and ending up upon one single postsynaptic neuron. So what happens when you do this? So this information which is coming from large number of presynaptic neurons, coming from large number of presynaptic neurons, is actually integrated. Okay, it is integrated to decide the onward effect. Okay, to decide the onward effect. So it is actually, don't you think this property of convergence is basically telling something same as the anatomical spatial summation, isn't it? You can see it is nothing but a kind of an anatomical spatial summation where you are bringing about inputs to one from different sources to converge on one terminal. So it is just a reflection of an anatomical you know, kind of a spatial summation. For example, you can see that if you take the example of convergence, so an anatomical basis of spatial summation, what is convergence? So termination of the signals which are coming from many sources, many presynaptic terminals on one postsynaptic neuron. For example, just consider spinal cord, the ventral horn cells in the spinal cord. They receive inputs simultaneously from different tracts: corticospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, and so on. Similarly, the interneurons of the spinal cord, they are receiving inputs simultaneously from the corticospinal, propriospinal, and the peripheral proprioceptive. So you are bringing about kind of an anatomical summation because of this property of convergence, right? Now, the totally opposite is what is called as divergence. What is divergence? Here, one presynaptic neuron terminating to many postsynaptic neurons, right? So what is this? This is one source. One source is converted into number of sources. See, it is converted into number of sources. So basically what you are doing over here is you are bringing about amplification of a single impulse. You are bringing about amplification of a single impulse. So one presynaptic terminating into many postsynaptic. That means one single impulse is converted into number of impulses. Okay, it is converted into number of impulses. They may either go to a single, that means the same tract. Okay, they may either go into a single or a same tract, or they may go up into multiple tracts. So the ultimate result is amplification. So one is converted into so many, right? For example, if you look into the dorsal column pathway, the sensory pathway, which you will be learning in the frequent lectures when we go on to the ascending and the descending tracts. The dorsal column, beginning all the way from the receptors, these pathways, they go up through the spinal cord, through the thalamus, and they relate to the brain. That is the cortex, the sensory cortex. But they can diverge and they can go to the cerebellum, forming the spinocerebellar pathways, to the thalamus, and then finally to the cortex. So one single is getting diverged into different areas. So you bring about the magnification of the impulse by this property of divergence. And remember that this property of divergence and convergence plays a very important role in another property, which is occlusion, facilitation, subliminal fringe. यहाँ पर occlusion, facilitation, subliminal fringe ऐसी complicated properties can be understood nicely when we know the concept of convergence and divergence. So synaptic inhibitions I'll be taking in the next lecture, because it is wholesome another LAQ also, so that I'll be covering in the part 2. Now let's move on to the property of what is called as a subliminal fringe and what is called as a occlusion. Now what can you see over here? What can you see over here? Look at this person. This person is trying very hard, isn't it? He's trying very hard to pick up a load which is beyond his capacity, isn't it? He's trying to pick up a load which is beyond his capacity, right? This person, the next person, he is easily picking up the load, very smoothly is picking up the load. ऐसे लग रहा है जैसे कि load बहुत light है as compared to the strength of the arms. That means now he could have used even more heavier load. So how does this take place? Let's get very clear with another property that is called as occlusion and subliminal fringe. Occlusion and subliminal fringe. Now, one thing which you should understand very nicely, that the brain is a complex neural circuitry. There are neighbors, and the neighbors have got a common wall. Suppose this is one house, this is one house, another house. This is the common wall. The same relationship you will see in the synapses, that they have got synaptic relationships. And because of that synaptic relationships, some of these can be stimulated, some of these can be inhibited, right? Now, what is subliminal? It is subthreshold. Okay, you know that when we speak of the type of stimuli, there is threshold stimuli, subthreshold, suprathreshold. So this is subthreshold. And what is fringe? Fringe is nothing but this is the border. For example, this is a beautiful frock I am wearing, and this is the frill of it. So this frill is something, but this is the fringe which I am speaking. Now similarly, in the case of neurons, suppose this is one major neuron, this is one major neuron. Between these two neurons, this is the frill or the fringe of the neurons which are sharing interpersonal relationship, right? They are sharing interpersonal relationship. So when I stimulate this neuron, when I stimulate this neuron A or B, I am going to affect the rate of excitability, right? I'm going to affect the rate of excitability of those neurons which are coming in the fringe of these two common neurons. ठीक है? So जो neurons हैं, इनके common neurons है, कुछ इनके common neurons है, जो मैंने बोला है कि they come in the frill or they come in the fringe. So when I'm individually stimulating AB or when I'm stimulating AB together, unka excitability is going to be affected. That is what is the basis of occlusion and subliminal fringe, boys and girls. So एक statement हम लिखते हैं so that you will become very easy with what ma'am is going to teach you. So remember that when one synapse is activated, okay, when one synapse is activated, the sensitivity of the other synapses can be altered. The sensitivity of other synapses can change. That means you can lower the threshold of excitation of those. Lower the threshold of excitation. मतलब अभी वो कम stimulus पर भी excite हो गए. You are lowering the threshold means you are making them more excitable. This phenomenon occurs nothing but due to the synaptic relationships with the synapse among each other. So this is nothing but this is the synaptic relationships of each other. So one single sensory neuron, it is going to make contact with multiple motor axons. It is not 1:1, है ना? So it is going to affect the activity of the motor neurons in different way. It may occlude some or it may sensitize some. That is what is the subliminal fringe or the occlusion all about. Now see. This is the property of subliminal fringe. So this property which we are dealing, or this figure shows us subliminal fringe. This is one neuron A, another B. This afferent is making direct connection with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That means when I stimulate A, I am going to stimulate directly these 5. Similarly, when I stimulate B individually, I am going to stimulate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So one afferent supplying 5, another afferent supplying 5. In between these two, A and B, these are the two neurons which are falling in the subliminal fringe. Okay, which are falling in the subliminal fringe. मतलब ये दो neurons common है A को और B को. So जब आपने A stimulate किया 5, आपने B stimulate किया 5, neurons activate हुए. But when you bring about stimulation of A and B together, okay, when you bring about stimulation of A and B together, you are stimulating 12 neurons and not 10. ये 5 और ये 5 के अलावा you are stimulating 2 other neurons. These 2 other neurons were falling in the subliminal fringe. But when you simultaneously stimulated A and B, you decrease their threshold for excitation so that their local potentials are now high enough to produce action potential. Got it? So जब हमको कुछ heavy weight उठाना है, right? तो उस heavy weight उठाने के लिए हम क्या करते हैं? अपना power बढ़ाते हैं, isn't it? We use more strength of stimulus. So when we are using gradual or more and more strength of stimulus, this we bring about facilitation of the neighboring neurons. So remember, whether there will be subliminal fringe, whether there will be occlusion, it totally depends upon the strength of the incoming stimulus. So अगर कुछ भारी उठाना है and the strength of the incoming stimulus is less, we are going to make it easier by this property of subliminal fringe. So यहाँ पर we were using subthreshold stimuli. But even though we were using the subthreshold stimuli, because of the property of the subliminal fringe, we were able to stimulate more 2 neurons which were falling in the common frill of the 2. Right? So this is with a weaker stimulus, a subliminal fringe. Now suppose there is suprathreshold stimuli. Right? So this is occlusion. So occlusion is always produced by a suprathreshold stimuli. Now, for example, I go to weights, I carry weights. Okay, suppose I am drinking water. I am teaching and I am drinking water. The water bottle was completely filled. I have emptied the bottle. I did not realize because I was very much engrossed either in studying or teaching. अब जब मैं वो बॉटल उठा रही हूँ, ये मन में सोच के कि दैट इज़ 1 लीटर की बॉटल एंड पूरी फिल है, बट जैसे मैंने उठाया तो मुझे पता चला अरे यार पानी तो ख़त्म हो गया है. दैट मीन्स जितनी एनर्जी मैं यूज़ कर रही थी 1 लीटर को उठाने के लिए, इमिजिएटली द एनर्जी विल लूज आउट, क्योंकि अब मुझे एक एम्प्टी बॉटल उठानी है. इसमें मैंने क्या किया, ज़रूरत से ज़्यादा ताकत लगाई. सो व्हेन आई एम यूजिंग अ सुप्राथ्रेशोल्ड स्टिमुलाई, ज़रूरत से ज़्यादा ताकत लगा रही हूँ, तो हम क्या करेंगे, या हमारे सिनाप्सिस क्या करते हैं, जो कुछ न्यूरॉन्स होते हैं उनको इनिबिट कर देते हैं. Right? They inhibit some neurons when you are using suprathreshold stimuli. So this property of summation and suprathreshold stimuli and the subliminal fringe, they play a very, very important role in the reflexes also. So you can see that when you are stimulating A alone, okay, when you are stimulating A alone, you are able to stimulate 10 efferents. and when you are stimulating B alone, you are again able to stimulate 10. But when you stimulated A plus B, surprisingly, you did not stimulate 20 or 25, you stimulated 15. That means ऐसे कुछ 5 न्यूरॉन्स होंगे जिनको हमने इनहिबिट कर दिया, बिकॉज जितनी एनर्जी हमने यूज की थी उसकी ज़रूरत नहीं थी. सो दिस प्रॉपर्टी ऑफ ऑक्लूजन, this property of subliminal fringe is very important. So occlusion में occlusion की जो property होती है, it is very important, you know, it helps in the when we speak about the reflexes, the tension that is developing in the reflexly contracting muscle rises and declines slowly, especially in polysynaptic reflexes where so many muscles are involved simultaneously of the either legs. You will have to use this phenomenon so that the rise in the tension will be slow and the fall in the tension will always be slow in the slowly contracting muscles. So whatever response is which we are getting, it is mainly because of the strength of the incoming stimulus. So you can see here par that occlusion is a divergent arrangement of neuronal circuits. It is a divergent arrangement of the neuronal circuits, right? So these properties, boys and girls, are very very important. So subliminal में हम क्या कर रहे हैं, लेस थ्रेशोल्ड स्टिमुलाई है, इसलिए जो थोड़े से कॉमन न्यूरॉन्स है उसको फैसिलिटेट कर रहे हैं. ऑक्लूजन में हम क्या कर रहे हैं, जो एक्स्ट्रा न्यूरॉन्स है उसको हम इनहिबिट कर रहे हैं. सो subliminal will always be by a subthreshold stimuli and occlusion will always be by a suprathreshold stimuli. One of the very very important example of the subliminal fringe is the reinforcement, okay, the reinforcement of the tendon jerks, the reinforcement of the tendon jerks through Gendra 6 maneuver, through Gendra 6 maneuver. So when we are going to teach you in the clinics what is Gendra 6 maneuver, you ask the subject to hold the fist and clench the teeth. You increase the rate of discharge of the gamma motor neurons so that the reflexes can be elicited. So this is a step later, but उस समय मैं आपको revise करवाऊंगी. That subliminal fringe is used in the reinforcement of the tendon jerks in the Gendra 6 maneuver, right? So because of the subliminal fringe, what happened, that the response that is obtained by the simultaneous stimulation of A and B, the response that is obtained by the simultaneous stimulation of A and B is much more than when you individually stimulate A or B. Whereas in the case of occlusion, when you individually stimulate A or B, you are going to excite more postsynaptic neurons or more efferent neurons. But when you bring about a simultaneous stimulation of A and B, the number of neurons that are excited will be less, right? Now let's end on this session with 1 or 2 MCQs so that we will be discussing this and ending up and covering this in the second session, where I will be taking your synaptic fatigue, facilitation, synaptic plasticity and the types of synaptic inhibition, right? So a revision of the last lecture. IPSP can be produced by opening of the sodium channels, calcium channels, closure of the potassium channels, or opening of the chloride. Now you know that IPSP means nothing but that is hyperpolarization, which is brought about inhibitory neurotransmitter like glycine or GABA, and इसमें you will have to bring in negative ions or you will have to give out positive ions. So the correct answer will be opening of the chloride channels, right? So we've covered one-way conduction, synaptic delay, property of summation, convergence, divergence, subliminal, fringe and occlusion. So boys and girls, never stop learning because there is no end to knowledge, right? So this is all for today for this lecture, which is the first part of your synapse, and the second part will be soon coming up for you. Happy learning. Thank you all and God bless you.